What is up, everyone? We're doing a bit of a new video today. I'm going to be ranking the top 10 best fantasy novels I have ever read. We don't usually do literature or novel videos on this channel. With my most recent one, and probably my first one, being the A Thousand Splendid Suns video essay that I did recently, and some upcoming ones, including the top 10 best novels I've ever read in general, and a video on Death of a Salesman. But today, I decided to go all out, and I wanted to do a whole bunch of fantasy novel videos on like a whole bunch of fantasy novels I read, like Lord of the Rings, Stormlight Archive, and some new ones I've read recently. But I decided to kind of culminate all this fantasy knowledge and analysis into one video and talk about the top 10 best fantasy novels I have ever read. Now, this isn't a list of my favorites, and more so the top 10 best I've ever read in terms of quality of the writing, the critical, from a critical sense, which one I listed the most emotion, which one had the biggest impact, and maybe even aspects of influence on fantasy novel as a whole. But this is going to be a pretty big video, to be honest. There's a lot of iconic novels here, a lot of modern ones, a lot of ones that people don't know too much about. But let's get started, shall we? Starting off with number 10, we have Malice by John Gwynne. This is the first novel in the Faithful and the Fallen series, and it kind of just drops you into this broken world with a whole bunch of inspirations from mythology and history, and it makes this world feel super historically rich, and rich with mythology and stuff from different cultures around Europe. And to be honest, though there's plenty of fantasy stuff in here, monsters, demons, angels, whole bunch of fantastical stuff, I feel like the this feels very much like a historical novel. It's very historically rich, and it blends so many different cultures into its narrative, Celtic, Welsh, Roman history, stuff like that. And it makes this feel like just such a rich world, not only with its fantastical elements, but with its history and mythology. There's plenty of war, there's plenty of stuff to go around in this book, but um even though the series as a whole is a grand and epic saga of gods and man and war and bloodshed, I feel like this one is the best in the series because it drops you into this world and it intrigues you from the first chapter. All this history, these deities, these entities, and these human characters amidst this bloody war, all kind of draws you into this historically rich world that kind of mirrors Europe in a way. And it was a big surprise for me. It's a modern fantasy novel. I wasn't expecting too much from it. My aunt recommended it to me, and it was a lot better than I was expecting. This is a fantastic masterpiece of a novel, masterful introduction to this series, and yet another instance of the best novel in a series being the first one, because it's such a strong introduction to this um, broken world falling apart. The Banished Lands is a intriguing world with all these different entities, people, wars, and so much inspiration from these different European cultures and histories and mythology that it makes it come to life in such a way that makes it feel like a real world. And that's when you've crafted a great fantasy novel, when the novel's world feels real, when it reads like it's a history book recounting events from real history. And this one, the fact that it blends actual real history and mythology into it only helps enhance this novel in that area. And it's John Wynn's magnum opus. He started off with a bang in this novel, and even though the rest of the books are great, and the Fury of the Gods is also a great like Norse fantasy novel, this meaty ass novel, fantastic. I recommend you read the Faithful and the Fallen saga. It's a pretty long series. The 4 books are pretty heavy, but if you have the patience for it, they are great reads. And note for the rest of the video, I won't be going over the plot and characters too much for these novels because I don't want to really spoil them. Some of them are set in certain points in the series where you got to know parts of the previous novels, and some of you guys would be maybe a bit lost if I went over the plot of them. So I'm just gonna look at them in a general lens and kind of a general synopsis of what happens. That's why I didn't really reveal too much about the story for this book. But yeah, Malice by John Gwynne. Great introduction. And there's going to be a lot of instances on this list where the first novel in the series is the best. In fact, the next two books are the first novels in their series. And speaking of, let's move on to number 9, Name of Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It is the first novel in the Kingkiller trilogy. Unfortunately, incomplete. When is the fucking third novel, Patrick Rothfuss? Now, I'd hold Patrick Rothfuss in a much higher regard if he just finished the damn series, but unfortunately, it still remains unfinished, as we all know. But it was sad. That's really sad because he really had something good going with this first novel. Now, the second novel is also great, but this, once again, first novel in the series is the best. It drew me in. The writing, the descriptions, the surroundings, how they're described in this novel is so fantastic. From the first chapter in that inn, it is magical. There's plenty of fantasy stuff in here, obviously, but once again, this is driven by characters. The main character, really great. I was into his story very much, and uh, what else? The world is also real nice to kind of explore, to look into. The four corners of civilization, the sort of what this novel, through its description of the world, kind of builds and builds with every chapter as it moves along. You know, his experiences in this world, the main character, and it really had something great going, and it expands upon this really well in the second novel, which makes it all the more sad that this third novel remains unfinished. Patrick Rothfuss has become the next George R. R. Martin when it comes to unfinished series, but even then, I'm not going to hold that against this novel as great read. I got this for Christmas, and it really sparked my interest in fantasy, and I kept going. I've continued to go ever since, and pretty meaty novel, as many may put. But yeah, I'm gonna be a bit vague in my description of these novels because I really don't want to reveal too much about the plot or the characters. I didn't reveal the name of the main character for this, but I'm just going off the top of my head what I liked about this. It's gonna get a bit more descriptive with the next novels, and but yeah, with this one, really liked it. Fantastic. I haven't done too much really praising. I've kind of said, "Oh, this is a good novel. This is masterpiece." But as we move along, I'll kind of get more into that area. But yeah, Name of the Wind, fantastic start to a fantastic unfinished trilogy. He could really cook up something masterful with that third book. Patrick, give us the third novel already. I've been waiting. I have been tapping my feet. You created something so nice with this first book, something so great. You continued it greatly with the second novel. You could wrap it all up so masterfully with the third one if you just put it out. At number 8, we have the novel that actually came alongside Name of the Wind and that Christmas gift I mentioned beforehand, the Stormlight Archive Book 1, The Way of Kings. This is one of my favorite novels ever written, and probably my favorite first book of any series, period. Because it just drew me in from the start with the assassination with Seth Sunson Valeno. That first chapter, that was great. And um, Brandon Sanderson, modern day Tolkien, alongside another author I'll mention later, but he creates such a unique world. That's my favorite aspect of this series, actually. You know, with so many other fantasy novels, there's inspiration from like real world stuff and inspiration from other fantasy novels. You know, there's plenty of inspiration in this book with other fantasy novels and real life stuff. But what Sanderson does with the Stormlight Archive, with Roshar and the Cosmere as a whole, as he crafts such a unique, one of the most unique worlds I have ever seen in media, period. Not just literature, but just in general, in any story I've ever experienced, you know? Even with Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of inspiration from like real life Europe, medieval Europe, and fairy tales from before Tolkien's time. You know, there's dragons, there's elves, stuff like that. You know, stuff that existed before Tolkien. There's plenty of inspiration he took, but with this book, the world feels wholly original. It feels almost alien to a degree where I can almost call this sci-fi in certain senses. You know, the world is a storm-ravaged planet that adapts to its environment, that adapts to its storms with crustaceans. And how does he come up with this stuff? That's what I was thinking when I first read this. And this is a great, perfect way to introduce yourself to that world. It drops you in with these characters, with these threads, and it kind of doles out inspiration about this world, about the High Storm, about the Parshendi, and the wars that are going on. You know, and the characters, they're all interesting. Sazeth, Colin, Sazeth, Dalinar, Shallan, and of course we can't forget Kaladin, the star of this series. They are all so interesting, and they have such varied stories. You know, with Sazeth and the assassination and its consequences, with Shallan and that exploration of Yasna Kolin and that city and all that magic stuff that goes on, and her backstory. That's all very intriguing. And of course, the two stars, Dalinar and Kaladin. Dalinar dealing with this conflict, and of course, Kaladin dealing with such a hell, this hellscape of the shattered plains and the plights he faces, but all being held up by Syl, who helps him keep going. And it's such a intriguing story that is not only driven by its fantastic world, but its fantastic characters as well. And man, oh man, I was craving more after finishing this book. And thankfully, it gets even better from here. You know, like I do like the first two novels in the Stormlight Archive more than I did the following book 3 and 4, but book 3 and 4 are also really fantastic versus these two 10 out of 10 starting novels. But yeah, um this book, the one I have right here, as you can see, it's really damaged, but that's because of how much time I spent with it, how much time I flipped through, and I just wanted more of this world. Roshar is one of my top 3 favorite fantasy worlds ever, right up there with Middle Earth and Malazan, but we'll get to those ones later anyways. But yeah, as you can see, I did kind of go on a bit of a tangent there with this one. It's going to be like that with later novels, but yeah, Way of Kings, fantastic introduction, got me hooked. It hooked me to the Stormlight Archive like a drug. Sanderson is one of my probably my favorite modern authors, and this was a fantastic introduction to him. And the rest of his works are also great. Mistborn's also great, but Stormlight's obviously the pinnacle of his writing. This next one is going to raise a few eyebrows. It's a the oldest book on this video, one of the oldest novels I've ever read. Not necessarily a novel, someone call it a poem, but you know what? Fuck it, I'm adding it to the video. We have The Odyssey by Homer, a timeless, one of the most iconic fantasy stories ever told. One that blends Greek myths and gods and all that stuff together to create such an epic tale of trying to get home. And even though all the grandeur and the gods and the characters are all intriguing, the story of Odysseus and him trying to get home in spite of everything in his way is so engrossing and powerful. And man, am I excited for Christopher Nolan's adaptation this year. It looks fantastic. Um, Unlike that one, though, this one doesn't have what's his name again? That one rapper guy that I saw in the trailer. I do not know what he was smoking when he decided to add that guy in. So that one doesn't have that. This doesn't have that problem. Obviously, the original is better. I just kind of add that in to kind of elongate it to spice this up. Um, but yeah, this one it's a classic. It's one that a lot of people know. It's a bit of a cheat adding this since this is technically a poem and it's so old at this point that some people wouldn't even consider it for their lists. But this is one of the most important fictional stories ever written. It is very influential, very impactful. In fact, it's had a lot of influence on modern stories, including some on this list. It it's the one of the first big epics, you know. In fact, it despite being centuries old. In fact, I think it might be over 1,000 years old. I don't remember when it was written per se, but it is, in spite of the many centuries that have passed since its publication, it still remains relevant. It still remains a engrossing story. And even though Odysseus' journey is obviously the best part, all the gods and the Greek mythology added in there to spice it up is obviously a nice touch. Um, with Poseidon and the Cyclops, all that stuff, fantastic additions. And even in spite of these literal god-sized challenges, these divine entities he must face, Odysseus still makes his way home, and that is such a powerful journey. The stuff with Odysseus is rich, it is engrossing, it's even emotional at some points. That scene where he reunites with his dog, I am not prepared to see that in the movie. But yeah, the Odyssey by Homer, even though some might not count it for a fantasy novel ranking, I'm counting it because it is as good as a lot of people have been saying. It is a fantastic piece of ancient literature, and I cannot wait to re-experience this story all over again with Christopher Nolan's masterpiece in a few months. The next book on this list is one that a lot of people, much like The Odyssey, wouldn't count for a fantasy novel ranking. But you know what? There's enough in it for it to count. We have The Stand by Stephen King. Very meaty boy. Oh boy, it is long. This is the uncut version, by the way. Best way to experience this masterful novel. Stephen King's magnum opus. I am so excited to see a potential adaptation of this in the future. But an adaptation of this would also be very hard. There hasn't been one in the past, but apparently it wasn't great. Anyway, so the novel itself, yeah, some people might not consider this a fantasy novel. It's more of a post-apocalyptic, realistic horror novel. But I feel like there's enough in it to technically count as dark fantasy. There's literally divine powers in here. There's some magic with like Randall Flagg, who great villain, by the way. I am He was intimidating little slimy villain in this novel, but there's enough in it for me to count it for this list. But it's not necessarily the fantasy stuff that makes this book so good. It's the way it manages to prey on human realistic fears to make this probably Stephen King's most terrifying novel from a realistic standpoint. Because yeah, there's some fantastical stuff in here, but the realistic end of the world, post-apocalypse, the apocalypse stuff in here is very eerie and kind of relevant in some ways. It is. It feels very much realistic, with people losing their minds, the world descending into madness, and the remnants of humanity kind of tearing each other apart. It feels very relevant and realistic in a lot of senses, and the way it just manages to set up a believable, realistic tale while still having fantastical stuff in there really just proves Stephen King's genius as a storyteller. This is more of a horror novel than it is fantasy, but like I said, enough fantasy stuff in there that I'm going to include it. This is one of the best books I've ever read. It is worth all the pages. Read the uncut version. It has... If you're not reading the uncut version, you're missing a lot. But yeah, it is a terrifying depiction of the end of the world and how people are affected by it, how people continue on after it, how they often adhere to these powers, and man oh man, that divine stuff is interesting as well. Fantastic book. More of a dark horror novel than it is fantasy, but like I said, I'd count it for this list because there's Randall Flagg. That's enough to count as a fantasy novel. Moving forward, we are coming up on a more recognizable author and his series, Game of Thrones. And the best book in the Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire series is, of course, A Storm of Swords. Now, I want to bring up what makes the books special as a whole is that despite being fantastical, the most interesting aspect of this fantasy series is the more realistic parts. It manages to bring up stuff like really relevant stuff like power, greed for power, war, conflict, bloodshed, houses vying for power, all this realistic medieval stuff that feels almost historical than it does fictional, kind of draws you in. No one is safe. All these characters they're vulnerable. There is no plot armor. Characters are dying here and there in these mindless, greedy conflicts for power across this very realistic world that, despite being fantasy, manages to draw you in not with the fantasy stuff, but more the lack of fantasy in its fantasy world. This medieval stuff feels so realistic and historical, as if you're dropping in on this bloody history of this bloody world that could very much have been real. Like, it's such a convincing novel realistic characters and conflicts, bloodshed. It is not, this novel does not hold back. It will kill off its characters, it will tear at your heartstrings, it will make you nauseous, and A Storm of Swords best highlights the best aspects of this series. Characters dying left and right, conflicts, that such mindless bloodshed for power. There is no like good, clear line between good or evil here. There's good guys, and then there's a lot of bad people. There's even worse people, and there's maybe a bit of a gray area. But characters in this series are complex and have multiple motivations. A lot of them are more not necessarily good, not necessarily evil, fall in a gray area, and there are plenty of vile, arrogance, just greed for power kind of characters in this series that really you really want to see a downfall of. I'm looking at you, Joffrey. Um, but yeah, Storm of Swords, best book in the series. It is it obviously highlights the conflicts, and the characters obviously very interesting. The bloodshed, the realistic intrigue of this world, Westeros and Essos, feel very real and alive. Despite being fantasy, they feel realistic in a way that, again, this feels more like a historical medieval novel than it does fantasy. And that's a big achievement for a fantasy novel, to make its more realistic aspects more interesting than its fantastical stuff. Like, yeah, there's plenty of fantastical stuff in here. Dragons, the ice people in the north, and plenty of other stuff. But this book really highlights that just realistic intrigue to this medieval political world, a political intrigue. I love when novels add in political intrigue in the midst of this plenty fantastical stuff. And I feel like Game of Thrones is what started that. The political intrigue in here is more interesting than the fantasy intrigue. And that is what I love about this series. It doesn't try to be fantasy despite being categorized as that. It's more realistic, you know? And that realism, that honesty, that breakaway from the traditional chosen one or good versus evil formula is what makes this such a raw and bloody series that draws me in. It is such a fantastic series. And again, A Storm of Swords, best book in the series. I unfortunately am yet to watch the TV series, but I doubt it can live up to the books and what especially this book sets up, especially season 8, given what a lot of people have said about that. That worries me. And once again, like Rothfuss, I'd hold George R. R. Martin in much higher regard because he's clearly a talented and a masterful author that manages to balance, actually not necessarily balance because there is more realistic stuff than there is fantasy in these novels, but manages to create such a realistic world while still having the courtesy of still having fantasy stuff in it. But in spite of that, he still hasn't given us Winds of Winter. Give us Winds of Winter now. What is stopping you, man? Your old ass is going to die one day, and if you do not give us Winds of Winter, you will not be regarded as a all-time great fantasy author anymore. You'll be regarded as one whom betrayed its fans. Give us Winds of Winter, Mr. Martin, please. I'm craving more. Anyways, yeah, Storm of Swords, fantastic, best book in the series. Encapsulates everything that kind of makes the series so special as one of the best fantasy, one of the best novel series ever. Period. To be honest, yeah, first book's great. All of them are great, and again, Winds of Winter could be one of the best books in the series as well. But I feel like what this one does, the peaks of this one, and the sacrifices, the gut wrenching scenes, they all peak here. It's the best that the series has to offer, and one of the best fantasy novels ever written. That doesn't even feel like fantasy at some points. At number 4, we have the first of the grandfather of fantasy literature's novels on this list. We have Children of Húrin by J.R.R. Tolkien. I've always been a fan of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but if I'm being honest, the first stage is probably my favorite era of Tolkien's Legendarium. It features um, such grand and ancient feeling history to this world. I'm running out of words. But yeah, like this is an era that feels so distinct from the like third age of Middle Earth that we see a lot of. And like there's so much stuff. There's Morgoth, these great wars, these gods, these the Valar, this detailed history, this tragic these tragic wars that result in the deaths of so many characters, it feels a lot more complex and rich than the Lord of the Rings, which is saying a lot, seeing how rich and just deep that the Lord of the Rings books are. But with the First Age, this is where everything started. You know, with the elves, with Valinor, with the gods, with Morgoth, who is my favorite villain in literature history. He's Sauron is but an echo compared to Morgoth. And though I was kind of intrigued to add Baron Luthien to this list as my favorite of the First Age Tolkien novels, I ultimately gave it to Children of Húrin, because this is the darkest novel Tolkien has ever written. I was surprised by how dark this one was. Unlike Lord of the Rings, which kind of deals with good versus evil, this one obviously has a clear good and evil, but there's also a bit of gray in here. You know, the characters are flawed. They do some pretty bad things. Cough, incest. um. Uh. Anyways, this one actually kind of feels like Tolkien's Game of Thrones in a sense, because there is so much bloodshed and betrayal in this book, and like so much vile stuff that happens. I was surprised knowing Tolkien's kind of style going into this, and it is obviously the most emotional book he has ever written as well. It's such a tragic journey to watch unfold. Watch Turin and his family kind of get torn apart and descend into madness and at the hands of such a vile dark lord. And knowing Hurin is witnessing all of this firsthand from the top of Angband just makes it all the more tragic. It is a gut-wrenching novel at times. And in some cases, I think it's even better than Lord of the Rings in some ways. Obviously, Lord of the Rings is the pinnacle of Tolkien's literature, and we're gonna get to that. It's obviously on this list. It's obviously gonna be really, really high. But Children of Húrin, favorite of the First Age books, despite having obviously a lot of fancy stuff with Glaurung, the elves, and the Valar. This one I feel has the most interesting character in Tolkien's Legendarium with Turin, his journey, his suffering, and just the way that it ultimately doesn't end with like a good ending, unlike Lord of the Rings. It shows that despite the good and evil, the good endings that Tolkien kind of put out, he wasn't afraid to go into areas where it's more realistic, it's more raw and vulnerable. It's much darker. He was willing to delve into these dark places with these novels, and Children of Húrin encapsulates that perfectly. You know, Baron and Luthien had some sad stuff in it, but it ultimately ended on a decently happy note. You know, there's a pretty satisfying ending for the couple. But here, um, may this family rest in peace. Holy crap, Morgoth. That's what I thought when this ended. There is suicide, incest, violence, and bloodshed all over the place here. It really encapsulates the evil and the suffering Morgoth has imposed upon the world in this novel, in the First Age as a whole. And seeing how it kind of bleeds into Lord of the Rings is also real interesting. But yeah, Children of Húrin, most emotional, tragic, dark book Tolkien has ever written, and one that I hold in a very high regard that needs to have an adaptation. I want to see this adapted. It would be hard, but I feel like it could work really well as like an animated adaptation. But yeah, the First Stage stuff in general is a lot more complex and grand than Lord of the Rings. So it wouldn't be easy to adapt, but I'd really want to see this as a movie one day. And even if it doesn't, I got the book. It is fantastic. Short read, but man, will it challenge you. That is Children of Húrin, my second favorite Tolkien novel of all time, and yeah, again, amongst some of the best fashion literature I have ever read. Okay, now we're getting into the top three. Starting with the top three is the first novel that's from the first like second novel in a series on this list. Uh, or not second novel, the first. There's I mentioned this before. I was gonna put a rule in here saying only one book per series, but I decided to break that rule in a couple of instances. One for Tolkien, which we'll get to later. Another for the Stormlight Archive. We have Words of Radiance at number three, the best sequel in fantasy. Probably my favorite sequel in all of literature. Words of Radiance takes everything that Way of Kings set up and expands upon it in such a masterful way. It takes everything that it set up and it just refines it to a T. It is perfect sequel, and it is just everything that the first one did great, amplified. The series is yet to kind of peak this high moving forward. Like the next three books in the series, they're great. But I doubt any other book in the archive could ever live up to this one. He cooked with this one. It takes these characters that it kind of set up and it continues their journey and even converges them. Like they did converge in the Way of Kings, but it converges them and it continues this grand trek against um through Roshar, and its story, holy crap, it had some great peaks. Obviously the action is great, but once again the characters are the most interesting part of it. The world is obviously fantastic, it expands greatly, and it feels like its own being here. But with Words of Radiance, when I finished reading this, I thought, wow, that was the best book I have ever read. This genuinely might be one of my top 5 novels of all time. I I dare not spoil some of the stuff that happens in here, so I'm not going to go too deep into a description of the story. But yeah, we continue to follow Shallan, Kaladin, Dalinar, and Sazeth through their journeys, and some new characters as well. But once again, this trek against Roshar, this conflict that's going on, and this just grand nature, this unique world continues on, and it is so engrossing, more so than the first book. And I kept on just flipping through. This is the most invested I have ever been in a fantasy novel. I wanted more. If the first one kind of started my introduction to the fans to the Stormlight Archive, the first one that kind of got me on this addiction to that got me hooked. This was an overdose of Stormlight Archive. It takes everything that I love about the series up to this point and it just expands upon it, and no other book in the series following that has ever can even hope of matching this peak. Kaladin is just such an interesting kind of protagonist. He's not the single protagonist of the series, but I like to call him the protagonist. But he is just such a fantastic protagonist, one of my favorite protagonists in literature, period. And this involves like such this feels like all those classic novels like Crime and Punishment, 1984, Anna Karenina. All those books are held in high regard as some of the best ever written. This feels like like a modern day example of this. Despite being fantasy, it feels like such a deep study of the characters of its world, such underlying themes. And I'd call this one of the greatest novels ever written, to be honest. Like, at least one of the best I have ever read. But I honestly haven't went too much into justifying my placement for this. Read it. That's all I'm gonna say. Just read the damn novel, and you'll see exactly why I have it held in such high regard. In fact, I was considering ranking this at number one, but the next two do kind of not necessarily top it in terms of quality. Like, yeah, they're better novels slightly, but more so with influence and just how they represent the best aspects of fantasy literature. Not to say that this doesn't represent it. This is one of the richest books I've ever read. It is wholly the complete package when it comes to the Stormlight Archive. Even if you don't like Way of Kings, keep on reading for this novel. I guarantee you there will be at least one storyline, one aspect of this book you will love, whether it be the world, the characters, the battles, the action. It is holy crap. That was when I finished reading this novel, I let out a breath and I said, holy crap. It has such great emotions, investment in the characters, political intrigue, and of course the world is still rich. But that's pretty much the best parts of the entire series, and this takes the best parts and it perfects them. This is the best sequel I have ever read, if I'm being honest. And one of the best fantasy novels ever, one of the best books I've ever read. And mind you, this is only number 3 on the list. We are in for a treat with the next two. At number 2, the second best fantasy novel I have ever read, very obviously was going to be on this list. We know it. We love it. This is often hailed as the best fantasy novel ever made and the most important fantasy novel ever. One of the most important books ever in period. A story that I hope lives on forever. one of the best books ever written, we have Lord of the Rings. This was guaranteed to be on this list. In fact, I was considering putting this at number one for its importance. Though number one did kind of surpass it in some areas, so I did put it at number one. But this book, it's as good as everyone says it is. Am I absolutely love the Lord of the Rings movies. Return of the King is my favorite movie of all time. The trilogy as a whole, favorite movies of all time. Some of my favorite pieces of media ever. Which goes to show that when I say this, I mean it. The Lord of the Rings is better than the movies. The book is better than the movies, and the movies are already some of the best ever made. This is one of the best novels I have ever read. It is as good as everyone said it is. The tale of good and evil through this rich, detailed world, this journey, this perilous journey with such intriguing characters. The hobbits, obviously, they're pretty charming. The suffering that Frodo has to go through to destroy this ring, yet he keeps moving forward in spite of the temptation he faces. Gollum is such a tragic little gremlin that we get to tag along in this story, and his conclusion is tragic as well. The books, the novel, I'm stuttering really bad in this video. The movies definitely do this novel justice, but there's definitely stuff that it could have explored more. So it's not necessarily a perfect adaptation. They're great movies, obviously, but obviously the novel is on a whole other level. Middle Earth is such a intriguing world to kind of live in, one that I desire to explore myself, even if I can never really do it aside from playing Lord of the Rings online. But that's a topic for another video. But yeah, you know Lord of the Rings. It's one of the most important books ever written. It sets up this fantasy universe that almost every fantasy novel almost every fantasy author following Tolkien has taken some kind of inspiration from. It is so rich in characters, in themes, in world. So many iconic moments that, yeah, we get to see them in the movies, but they are even better in the book. So much stuff that the movies kind of glossed over, and that was so great in the book. Uh, I don't really know what to say that hasn't been said before about Lord of the Rings. It's one of the most important books I've ever read. I already said that. What else can I add that hasn't been said before? But yeah, it feels like a complete journey. Like the movies. Yeah, they're really long. They get to detail this big journey, but the book, it's long. It had to be separated into 3 different volumes, and I know there's a lot of people saying this is technically a book trilogy. You can't just include the entire trilogy. Screw you guys. I'm counting it as one big book. Anyways, like I was saying, this book is long enough that it feels like a complete journey that we are taken on alongside these characters. We feel like we go on this journey, this perilous journey with the characters. It details every event that kind of completes this journey, and it all comes together into this cohesive, powerful book that just goes to show the battle against good and evil. That definitely has a good ending, even if obviously we know what happens at the end. I'm not going to spoil it if you've been living under a rock for a century, but in the end, the ending's very bittersweet. But the entire journey is one that I feel a lot of people would get post reading depression from, because you want to continue to get lost in this world with its characters, to go on these great journeys, and fortunately, you can, because Tolkien and his son have created so many detailed novels that explore Middle Earth and its many places, its many events, its many peoples. And Lord of the Rings, obviously the pinnacle of this universe, the most important fantasy novel ever written, and one of the best novels of all time as a whole. One of the best fantasy books of all time. I was really, really, really tempted to put this at number one, because it's at the top of pretty much every best fantasy book of all time list, because it's so important. Like, yeah, if we're taking an influence, it's probably the best fantasy book ever made, but there is one fantasy novel from one series that somehow tops it. And to be honest, it's a strong contender for the best book I have ever read. So, what is the fantasy novel that tops Lord of the Rings? The one novel that can rule over all fantasy books? Well, it is part of a much larger saga. If you're not familiar with Steven Erikson and Esselmont, I recommend you check their series. Even if you're an impatient reader, it is worth it. You pretty much know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Malazan, Book of the Fallen. Malazan is the one fantasy franchise and universe that I feel could potentially be better than Lord of the Rings, than the Tolkien Legendarium. Maybe not as important, maybe not as influential, but the world of Malazan, it feels so grand and so uh, the scope of the series spans multiple continents and cities and so many characters and um, so many realms and countries across this large world and so many tribes and cultures, and it is the richest fantasy world since Lord of the Rings. It spans 10 novels. The main series is obviously the best, but there's so many other sub-series in this world that continue exploring this rich universe. But yeah, the series as a whole, complex, confusing at times, but at the end of the day, it is worth it. Even if you have to write pages of notes to keep up with what's happening, it is worth every single page, every single sentence, because it all culminates in one of the best conclusions in fantasy literature with the crippled god. To be honest, probably my favorite conclusion in all of literature. Like, such a perfect conclusion that takes all these threads, resolves them, but at the same time also presents so many other new threads that could be expanded on in the future. But also, The Crippled God isn't the best book in the series. The best book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and the best fantasy book I have ever read in extension, is Book 3, Memories of Ice. This is the best novel I have ever read. And I have read some of the best novels of all time. I have read Crime and Punishment. I have read Anna Karenina, Don Quixote, In Search of Lost Time, To Kill a Mockingbird, all the big ones. Best of fantasy, as we've seen mentioned before, best of other literary genres. And those are all fantastic, obviously. Great Gatsby is another one I can mention. All live up to the hype. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, all those authors, George Orwell, Shakespeare. I have read their works. They're all great. They live up to the hype. But I have yet to come across a fantasy novel quite like the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And the best aspects of this series all meet their peak here. All comes together. This is the complete package. I have never been blown away by a novel quite like this one. Memories of Ice is a perfect novel. It is a just grand masterpiece, and it has everything you can ask for from not only a fantasy novel but a novel in general. Yes, it's complex. Yes, it's maybe confusing at some points, but that's a part of the charm. You feel like you're engaging with a real world that is built up across this grand series, and maybe it's not as satisfying as Crippled God, because that's obviously the ending of a grand series. But with Memories of Ice, it takes everything that's been established in like Gardens of the Moon and The Dead House Gates, which both are great novels, by the way. Gardens of the Moon was a fantastic introduction that got me hooked on this series. It's a bit confusing at some points, a bit to a fault. And Dead House Gates is also a great continuation, better than Gardens of the Moon, but again, it can be a bit confusing. This one, the confusion actually adds to the novel, enhances it, because in spite of all the stuff that you have to keep track of in here, you want to understand it. You are motivated to kind of get an image of what's going on. It has everything. It has grand fantasy intrigue and concepts, gods, wars, and fantasy creatures, and magic, and everything. But at the center of it, it's also very rich in characters, and the characters aren't safe either. There is so much gut wrenching emotional sacrifices. No one is safe. Characters keep dying. It is I could not believe what I was reading at some points in this novel and the series as a whole. There are so many moments in here I'm like, holy fuck. He actually wrote this. But yeah, everything you can ask for. Characters, world, war, action, emotional stuff. It makes this is probably the closest a novel has ever brought me to crying or elicit an emotional response. The characters that were set up in previous novels, the concepts, the wars, everything. Jenna Bacchus is they continue your journey in the wars in Jenna Bacchus, which is, by the way, just one continent in this ever expanding world upon so many grand continents and islands and cities and characters and conflicts and tribes and cultures and worlds and gods and everything. I cannot praise the Malazan Book of the Fallen enough. And the best aspects of probably the best fantasy series ever written all culminate in Memories of Ice. It is not an easy read, but it is worth every second, every word that you gloss over with your eyes in this book. It's worth it. The characters, their journeys, their arcs, their redemptions, or their downfalls are so intriguing to watch unfold across this just grand world, this grand conflict. Gods walking among men, people dying left and right. This is the complete fantasy package. I love Malazan more than I do Lord of the Rings, than the Tolkien Legendarium. I love it's if I could read one fantasy series for the rest of my life, it would be Malazan. And like, yes, you do have to read the previous two novels to understand this one. And this one does continue the stuff set up, and this one is expanded upon in the following books. But though some do come close, none of the books before or after this in the Malazan series comes a close, doesn't hold a candle to the absolute masterpiece, the absolute expectation defying, emotionally gut wrenching, intriguing, masterful magnum opus of Steven Erickson's magnum opus of a universe. This is, if you had to ask me, what is the best book of all time? I'd say this one. It's better than some of the best novels of all time that people like to hold in such high regard. In Search of Lost Time, Crime and Punishment, Great Gatsby. I'm kind of going off the top of my head. You know the ones I'm talking about. Catcher in the Rye, Don Quixote, all these big, fantastic novels. They're great. But Malazan feels like a real, breathing, bleeding world that you are taken in from the first sentence from Gardens of the Moon and are emotionally wrecked by in this book and other books, but most emotionally wrecked by in this one. Memories of Ice is the best fantasy novel ever written, and you cannot convince me otherwise, unless there's one I haven't read yet, but I am yet to discover one that kind of matches this one in terms of not only scope and grandeur, but emotion and complexity and intrigue in just so many moving parts. Every aspect of this. The writing is fantastic. The characters are so intriguing. The world, the conflict. You want to see it unfold before your eyes upon this page. And no matter how good an adaptation of Malazan is, I don't think it could ever do these books justice. They're not for everyone. Sorry, they're not for everyone. But even if the first two don't work for you, I guarantee Memories of Ice will hit you like a fucking ballistic missile. It sure did me. It eviscerated me. There's only one piece of media that's ever made me cry, and that's Schindler's List. And that's because I watched it when I was young. It kind of desensitized me to stuff. And no book has ever made me physically crying. But man, oh man, this book deserves to have deserves my tears. It deserves to make me break down, to make me into a sobbing mess because holy fuck, this is the complete package right here. This is my favorite thing ever. I think about this every single night. I have never forgotten about some of the moments in this. Like, yes, some of the best books in the series are also fantastic. Toll of the Hounds, Bone Hunters, The Crippled God, The Dead House Gates. They're all fantastic. And if it weren't for my only 2 books per series rule, maybe some of them would be on here. But no other book in the Malazan series best represents its peak, its intrigue, better than this one. It's worth every page. It is a great conclusion to the first trilogy in this series, and I cannot wait to return to it. It makes me want. It makes me crave more of a series, more than any other series I've ever read. I craved Malazan. I craved even more Malazan, more than I did. More than I craved more Stormlight Archive after I read the first book. And even though the first 2 novels aren't easy, this one also challenging, but it will motivate you to keep going, because I have harped, I have rambled, but I know nothing I can say. Even if I made a 5-hour video explaining why this is such a masterful, just gut-wrenching novel, it won't do it justice. The only way you can do it justice is by continually dedicating yourself to this franchise. Not just this book, but the story as a whole. Because Malazan is the best journey I have ever taken in fantasy literature, in literature in general. One of the best, most grand, and epic stories I have ever had the pleasure of experiencing. And this is the best story, journey, characters, and just intriguing fantasy novel I have ever had the pleasure of cracking open. I want more, Erickson. That 10-book series, despite its long length, isn't enough. Not he could write there are more than 20 books in this series, but they're not enough. I want more. I want more of this universe. I want to get sucked in this universe more than I did Roshar and Middle Earth. And again, Memories of Ice. Start the series, even if it's just to read this book. It is worth it. Even if you hate Gardens of the Moon and Deadhouse Gates, I assure you this will elicit some kind of reaction from you. Even if you don't like this novel, which if you do, I'm convinced that I'm convinced that you have no soul. But if you don't like this novel, even if you don't even if you find it confusing, overly long, confusing, convoluted, and just not your thing, you surely will not forget it. Even if you hate this novel with every fiber of your being, you will not forget it. You will not forget what goes on. You will not forget the gut-wrenching sacrifices. You will not forget the set pieces, the mind-bending sequences, some of the stuff that goes on in here. Holy crap. Read Malazan, even if it's just to make it to this novel. It is worth every penny. If you don't like the start, you will love this, and you will want more after this. Best novel I've ever read. Best fantasy novel ever written. The only fantasy novel that I feel surpasses Lord of the Rings. The only series that I feel can top it. Read Malazan. In fact, this video, probably my biggest excuse for making this video in the first place is just so I could recommend Malazan, so I can recommend this book. All these other books, they're great, they're fantastic. I mean, they're some of the best I've ever read. That's what this video is for. But this entire video was just so I can get to talk about Memories of Ice. Read Memories of Ice. I mean, read the previous 2, obviously, because you're going to be lost. This one continues some of the stuff in that one. But read those so you can read Memories of Ice. And if you are not interested in the rest of the series after Memories of Ice, I'm convinced that you don't like reading. You don't like intrigue. I don't hold any strong opinions on novels, and I'm fine if people don't like it. But I'd be shocked if this didn't elicit anything from you, because this is the best novel, one of the best novels you will ever read. Surely the best I've ever read, and I've just been constantly rambling on. I haven't really justified why this is the best novel I've ever read, but the only way I can justify it is by recommending it and having you read it, because I dare not speak a word of what goes on in this. The characters, you obviously you'd be lost. You wouldn't understand what's going on, but you need to experience this story for yourself, these characters, and this war that's going on, because it will draw you in like no other book you have ever read. Well, maybe not everyone. If you're an impatient reader, I wouldn't recommend it, because this isn't for everyone. But for those who stand by and continue to trudge through the previous 2 books, your efforts, your time spent in the series from the first two novels will all be worth it, because you will make it to these godly masterpiece of a novel that I wish I could re-experience for the first time again. I want, if a genie in a bottle came to me and asked me some of my issues, my first wish would be so I could that I my first wish would be to erase my memory of this series so I could re-experience it again. In fact, I'd probably do that 3 times, which is saying a lot, seeing how a lot of the desires I have. But yeah, this series is worth it if you're patient, if you're willing to stand by. Even if you don't like any of the other novels in the series, surely this one you will get some semblance of enjoyment from. Read Malazan so you can get to this godly masterpiece of a novel, and trust me, it will be worth every page spent, every word read, every second trying to piece together this ever growing web of just events and concepts. It'd be confusing at first, but you'll be so interested that you'll be willing to deal with all this complex shit. It is worth it. Read the books so you could get to this masterpiece. I cannot stress that enough. Anyways, yes, that was my top 10 best fantasy novels I've ever read. Not necessarily the best of all time. I don't have the authority for that because I haven't read every fantasy novel ever. Though if you had to ask me, obviously Memories of Ice would win. Though the most important would probably go to Lord of the Rings. But yeah, that's kind of the best fantasy novels I've ever read so far. Maybe that list is changing, and if you ask me any other day of the week, it could be turned around, rearranged. Maybe some could be taken off in favor of other ones. The one thing that will always stay constant, though, is the top two. I feel like these two are always going to be the top two. And Memories of Ice is better than Lord of the Rings. I can say that confidently. But yeah, I recommend these books to everyone. Even if you don't like some of them, you will find at least 1 or 2 books in this list that you will like. Trust me, it's worth it to explore these worlds, these characters. Fantasy is my favorite genre because it gives such possibility, such freedom to just create the world you want, create the systems and rules that govern this world and the characters that kind of respond to what's going on. I love fantasy. These are some of my favorite novels ever. And if you want me to do a top 10 best novels I've ever read, just not just any genre, just best novels I've ever read, period, um, I'm going to put up a goal. If we can hit 5,000 subscribers, I will do the top 10 novels I've ever read. But even if I don't, you know that number one's probably going to be Memories of Ice, obviously. But yeah, get into fantasy, you'll find something that you'll like. Whether it be Lord of the Rings or the Stormlight Archive or Malazan, you'll find something to your liking. Fantasy is such a varied genre, not just a genre. I think fantasy as a whole is an art form because it allows authors, directors, writers to craft such rich worlds that they are in control of. They don't need to adhere to realistic rules like they could with like a realistic fiction novel. With a fantasy novel, you're in control and you can create some of the most interesting, intriguing worlds, characters, concepts, races, and stuff in your own novel. You're in control with this genre, and it is allowed for writers to produce some of the most intriguing, masterful books I have ever read, that many people will ever read. And because of the creation of fantasy, we got Memories of Ice, we got Malazan, so it was worth it. I don't know what else to say. This video was not really planned out, or I didn't really write a script for it. This is my first big like literary ranking video, but hey, it wasn't too bad for my first shot. It's a bit messy. I didn't really have much to say about certain novels at certain points. I didn't really go over like I didn't justify why they're on the list because I didn't want to spoil it. This video is not necessarily an analysis of these novels, but more of a recommendation, some of the best. I'm definitely going to do a video on Malazan and Memories of Ice and maybe some of the other novels on this list, but yeah, that's really all I got to say. Check out these books. Check out Malazan. I swear to God, I will kill